Okay, good morning. To the almost last panel of our conference, which is called From Europe's Edge, Fluid Imaginaries of Centers and Peripheries in Eastern Europe. And we are going to make a tour from Russia, from the periphery, through the semi-periphery, Hungary, and Slovakia, and to something which I would prefer, or many people would prefer, to be called a center, to Prague. But obviously, and there are simply, I think there are persons who would object Prague being characterized as the periphery, but nevertheless, we kind of agreed upon that Prague is still on the periphery of Europe. First, I welcome Faith Hillis from the University of Chicago. I'm also going to be very brief in the introduction again, because I think you all are able to read the CVs in our abstract. I think she changed her title, but I give her the floor immediately.
Yes. Well, I'd like to begin, first of all, by thanking the organizers of this wonderful conference. It's been a very fruitful few days, and also thanking all of you for being here very early on this last day. So one of the most mysterious aspects of modern political anti-Semitism is the speed with which it permeated the continent in the 1880s and 1890s. Within a mere 10 to 15 years of the term anti-Semitism being coined, mass appeal anti-Semitic movements had become a powerful force in European politics, thinking about, for example, Stecker in Berlin, Lueger here in Vienna, and the Anti-Dreivisar in France. Historians usually point to the role of social and economic factors that transcend national boundaries to explain this remarkable rise of this new political and racial anti-Semitism. They speak, for example, about structural transformations in the economy, boom and bust cycles, and the disenfranchisement of the lower middle classes. This paper identifies another factor that led to the sudden rise of anti-Semitism, and that is human mobility and migration. The increased ease of travel and transit in the late 19th century facilitated contact between people from very different walks of life, and it provided opportunities for new transfers of ideas from one national context to another. In my paper, I'll be examining how human traffic between the Russian Empire and the liberal states of France and England resulted in transfers of anti-Semitic ideologies from east to west. And I'll argue that the peculiar breed of anti-Semitism that emerged in late imperial Russia in fact played an important role in shaping Western mass anti-Semitic movements. Before I go further, let me say a few words about how I'm understanding late 19th century Russian anti-Semitism. The most influential work of Russian anti-Semitism was this work behind me, the Book of the Kahal, which was published by Jakob Brofman in 1868. Brofman was himself an apostate from Judaism, and he invoked his knowledge of Jewish ritual to unveil the supposedly secret conspiracies in which Russian Jews were involved. The organ for the conspiracies described in this book is the Kahal, which is the Jewish organ of self-governance in Imperial Russia. In fact, interestingly enough, this Kahal had been abolished in 1844, but Brofman argued that the fact that you don't see it still operating is actually what proves it's a secret conspiracy. So this is a kind of pre-emancipation take on the Jewish question, right? The aim of this conspiracy, supposedly operated by the Kahal, was cultural. It was to destroy the Russian people and their traditions. And this work of conspiracy theory also imputes a sort of racial and cultural unity to the Jews. So already in this book, in the 1860s, we can see a concept of a Jewish racial conspiracy operating in Russia. And in fact, I would argue that this idea is quite precocious. It's only in the 1880s that we began to see similar ideas in the Western European context. 19th century Russian anti-Semitism was also unique in the way that it was applied. So this Brofmanian conspiracy theory, in fact, served as a technology of rule and of governance. The Book of the Kahal was printed for the first time on the printing press of the Governor General of Vilna, and it was reprinted and expanded several times. It was widely read and believed by Russian officials, and in fact guided many of their efforts to shape the Jewish policy in the 1870s and 80s. So Russian archival sources very openly discuss their belief that Jews are involved in this conspiracy to oppress Russians, and this belief in part helped drive a new series of laws in the 1880s that further limited Jewish ability to hold land and also Jews' access to university. Many Russian officials also insisted that Jews were responsible for the revolutionary unrest that began to appear in Russia in the 1870s. and therefore, many of them did little to stop the wave of pogroms that broke out after the 1881 assassination of Tsar Alexander II, speaking of anti-Jewish violence as a sort of justified revenge for this revolutionary agitation, and you see a picture of this violence here. At least in the 1860s, it's difficult to find a Western analog to Brafman. The concerns of the adversaries of the Jews in Europe's liberal society tend to be quite different from Brafman's illiberal Russia. Western anxieties tended to focus on the negative effects of emancipation, for example, on the Jewish role in capitalism, in commerce, and in society. So in other words, these Western anxieties are about integration. Brafman's anxieties, by contrast, centered on the Jews as a state within the state. So again, this lack of emancipation in Russia is crucial to this whole context. So this paranoia of Brafman's account, I think, is rather out of step with the kind of positivist, rationalist mode that was still operational in Western Europe in the 1860s. Indeed, European commentators tended to look down on Brafman's conspiracist anti-Semitism as an unwelcome throwback to the past. Politicians and journalists skewered Russian anti-Semitism as medieval, as barbarian, and as obscurantinist. A contributor to Le Figaro in 1882 boasted that France, with its enlightened, rational public, could never sustain the kind of mass anti-Semitic movement like that had taken shape in Russia. And in fact, this illustration is another sort of condemnation. It's from a British illustrated journal showing this graphic violence in negative terms. So, how did this distinctive Russian anti-Semitism find its way into Europe's liberal states? This is where the angle about human mobility comes in. In the late 19th century, hundreds of thousands of Russians left the empire for the university towns and large urban centers of Central and Western Europe. Paris and Geneva were the primary destinations for this immigration, and Geneva and Zurich were secondary centers, although there were Russians, of course, scattered all over the continent. These Russian immigrant communities were exceptionally diverse. They included men and women from all over the empire, and their residents ranged from professional revolutionaries to working-class Jews fleeing pogroms to university students. But Jews played a particularly prominent role in these communities. Jews were 160 times more likely to immigrate from Russia than the general population, and this is precisely because of these adverse conditions they faced. And they constituted some 40 to 70% of the immigrant population, depending on the locale. Furthermore, the Jewish question was one of the major political preoccupations of these immigrant communities, which were extremely politically active and served as a sort of civil society in exile. So these Russian immigrant communities became an organizing base for Bundists, for Zionists, for Jewish socialist groups, all endeavoring to free Russia's Jews. And many non-Jews joined in these conversations and this agitation, treating the persecution of the Russian Jews as really evidence of everything that was wrong with the Russian regime. Already by the 1870s, these immigrant communities abroad had become a great concern to Tsarist officials. In addition to being hotbeds of conspiracy, where activists openly plotted how to overthrow the Tsarist regime, they were prolific producers of illegal texts that were then smuggled back into Russia. And then furthermore, in spite of the radicalism that flourished in these communities, Europe's liberal states, for the most part, allowed them to operate unharassed. So in fact, Britain, France, and Switzerland all recognized these diverse groups of Tsarist immigrants as political refugees and shielded them from extradition attempts. And even the most radical Russians enjoyed substantial support from Europeans. So I found these amazing counts of these bourgeois citizens of Geneva and Paris in the 1880s declaring their solidarity with Russian radicals after the 1881 assassination of the Tsar. By the early 1880s, the Tsarist state resolved to take action against the growing immigrant diaspora. It opened a Paris-based branch of the Okhrana, the Tsarist secret political police, and it was charged with infiltrating these overseas communities. The Okhrana became the bête noire of Tsarist subjects abroad, recruiting a network of informers from within the immigrant community. It engaged in spectacular acts of sabotage, such as destroying revolutionary printing presses. And it employed agents provocateurs to circulate inciting and incriminating information to embarrass and divide revolutionaries. The Tsarist secret police also seized on the Jewish question, which I've already suggested had become very symbolically important in these immigrant communities. And so in 1881, the Tsarist secret police assumed control of an influential immigrant newspaper in Geneva, edited by the Ukrainian radical Drahomanov. With this new police subsidy, this paper began to challenge the political narrative that had emerged from these immigrant communities, which tended to be sympathetic towards Jews. The paper charged that Jews had infiltrated the Russian revolutionary movement and were on the verge of seizing control of it for their own purposes. And it urged Aryans among the immigrant community to mobilize against Jewish turncoats. So we're already seeing in 1881 this very racialized language. This episode is the first example of the Ochrana trying to turn the Jewish question into the Achilles heel of the immigration. But more interesting for our purposes, the Ochrana also organized a similar campaign that endeavored to shape European public opinion, not just to divide these immigrant communities. This campaign was masterminded by Piotr Raczkowski, whom you see here, who served as the director of the Paris Ochrana between the 1880s and 1902, and who envisioned outreach to Europeans as a crucial part of his job. He cooperated with conservative Russian publicists active in Britain and France, and also worked to cultivate relations with salons and with European journalists. He published several pamphlets of his own, mostly in France, under a variety of pseudonyms, and contributed to European publications. You see just a few of them behind me here. And in the 1890s, he even incorporated a formal press agency, which placed articles in respected newspapers and placed its own agents on editorial staffs. These Russian contributions to European public debates had three major aims. First of all, they aimed to discredit the political immigration by charging that Russian immigrants were parties to an international Jewish conspiracy. Raczkowski insisted that the revolutionary immigration was virtually all Jewish. He insisted that revolutionaries did not speak for the Russian people. Real Russians, he would argue, were loyal to the Tsar, loved the Tsar as a father. Furthermore, he argued that the revolutionaries' claims that they wanted to improve life for ordinary Russians were false. In fact, he claimed their goal was to destroy the Russian state and to enslave its people under a Jewish yoke. So we see here, I think, a very early precursor of this Judeo-Bolshevik legend, even before we have Bolsheviks that we talked about yesterday. The second aim of this agitation was to spread hatred against working-class Jews who had immigrated to the West by portraying them, like the revolutionary immigration, as dangerous criminals. So this police press agency published a great deal about the pogroms in Russia. The clear goal of this coverage was to erode the sympathy that the Russian Jews had enjoyed in European society. According to accounts that can be linked to this Tsarist press agency, the victims of pogroms were not innocent victims. Rather, they were aggressors who had exploited and enslaved the peasantry for centuries, and the violence to which they were subjected was thus just deserts. The press agency also worked to raise concerns about the effects of mass immigration on Western society. So, for example, when victims of Jack the Ripper began to turn up in Whitechapel, where many of these Russian Jews had immigrated in 1888, Russian propagandists relentlessly promoted the notion that the killer was a deranged Russian Jew, and these were rumors that eventually caught on in the British public sphere. The final effort of this Russian agitation abroad was to suggest that Russian Jews posed a direct threat to Europeans. Raczkowski charged that with the mass immigration of Russian Jews to the West, Christian Europeans would begin to face the same exploitation that their Russian brothers had faced for centuries. Even worse, he insisted, the migration of Russian Jews had extended this international conspiracy first described in Brofman. He charged that Russian Jewish criminals had conspired with Europe's Jewish elite, using assimilated Jews of the West to craft these liberal asylum laws which had offered protection to these Russian immigrants. So the only way for Europe's Aryans to protect themselves from these incipient threats, Raczkowski argued, was to destroy the liberal systems that had emancipated Jews, thereby excluding and marginalizing the Jewish population. Now, all three of these arguments and efforts really built on Brofman's conspiracy theories and introduced them to an international audience. And in fact, in some of these pamphlets that I've shown here, Raczkowski is actually including large parts verbatim of this book of the Kahal. But as this language of conspiracy entered on an international stage, it also became more elaborate. So the conspiracy theories put out by the Russian secret police, they involve both Russian and Western Jews, emancipated and unemancipated Jews. And so I argue that this notion of all kinds of Jews from all over the world, all different national contexts conspiring, that this is actually it's connected to this migration, right? And this is a key part of what allows anti-Semitism to begin exploding on this global level. Raczkowski did not only rely on his media campaigns to foment anti-Semitism, he also used several other tactics. As I mentioned, he used agents provocateurs to upset the revolutionary immigration, but he also used them to produce a sort of anti-Semitic theater that was aimed at Europeans. Raczkowski staged several outrages that were designed to indict Russian Jews, and the most effective of these occurred in France in 1890. Rachkovsky sent one of his secret agents, who happened to be Jewish, into a circle of young Jewish intellectuals in Paris. The agent incited the youth to build bombs and even supplied them with the materials. As the plot neared its completion, Rachkovsky swooped in and alerted the French authorities to this alleged bomb plot. So in addition to allowing Rachkovsky to argue for Russia's role, that Russia played an important role in agitating against this incipient global war on terror, this scheme also provided Europeans an opportunity to discuss the Jewish roots of many of the conspirators. And you see here some French coverage of this bomb plot. Rachkovsky also integrated himself into informal networks of pro-Tsarist publicists who worked to amplify his ideas. One of the most important of these publicists was this woman, Olga Novikova, who ran an influential salon out of Claridge's Hotel in London. She was a regular contributor to The Times and an author of numerous books, and she shared Rachkovsky's interest in promoting anti-Semitism to discredit the Russian revolutionary immigration. She published numerous articles in Britain presenting pogroms as the righteous revenge of the oppressed masses, and she blamed the 1891 famine that devastated Russia on a Jewish conspiracy. In Paris, Rachkovsky became involved in a very influential salon run by a woman named Juliette Adam, and this was a circle in which one-time Republicans began exploring more radical forms of nationalism and anti-Semitism. The circle was deeply implicated in the Boulanger affair and also in the Dreyfus affair, and the salon, which was associated with a journal of its own, enthusiastically reprinted some of Rachkovsky's books. So my argument is that promoting anti-Semitism became a coordinated foreign policy goal of the Tsarist state, designed to undermine the situation of its subjects who sought refuge abroad and also the asylum that Western states had granted them. Now, of course, the million-dollar question is, what are the actual effects of this campaign? And this is difficult to gauge because, of course, by the 1880s, the Western powers themselves are generating their own new virulent forms of anti-Semitism. But I want to conclude by isolating a few cases in which I think we can trace the direct transfer of these ideas from the Russian context to the liberal European context. One way of doing so is by looking at events. So this faux Paris bomb plot, for example, of 1890 that I mentioned had momentous effects. It marked a key turning point in French public opinion towards Tsarist immigrés. After this spectacle, which was designed to connect Jewish immigrants to the threat of terror, we can observe a rapid increase of anxiety about immigrant communities in France. We can trace this, first of all, through the archival records. So we began to see citizens of Western democracies appealing to states to protect them from these dangerous Russians, and even writing to the Russian embassies to denounce Russian immigrants whom they know. And there's an explicit discussion of the supposedly revolutionary inclinations of Jewish immigrants that appear not only in that French coverage, but also in British newspapers and in police records. So Western police began to buy these canards themselves. Another way of tracing this influence is to look at networks. So it turns out that many of the prominent European entrepreneurs of anti-Semitism had close relations to my Russian actors. Novikova, the Russian publicist whom I mentioned, was close friends with W.T. Stead, the pioneer of new journalism, who was a regular at her salon. Stead's Pall Mall Gazette was among the first British papers to voice complaints about the supposedly deleterious effects of Jewish immigration, and it gleefully republished these Russian charges that Jack the Ripper was in fact a Russian Jew. The most prolific and influential anti-Semite in France, Edouard Drumont, can also be connected to my Russians. His anti-Semitic league, he was an active member of the French salon in which Rachkovsky participated. And his anti-Semitic league republished numerous works of Rachkovsky. In fact, one contemporary argued that Rachkovsky was even funding Drumont and his anti-Semitic publications, though I myself have not found corroboration of this. Drumont is often credited with ushering in a new era of anti-Semitism in his works, which presented Christian Europe as captured by Jewish rich bankers on the one hand and overwhelmed by Jewish paupers and revolutionaries on the other. But I think that we should pause and ask just how original Drumont's ideas were. Indeed, Drumont himself openly credited Russian anti-Semitism as a major inspiration in his thought. He wistfully discussed his desire to see French Jews, like Russian Jews, isolated from mainstream society and persecuted by the government. And I think it could also be argued that Drumon's infamous conspiracy theories owed something to this Brahmanian tradition, and in fact regularly republished Russian conspiracy theories in his publications. So for example, the newspaper that he wrote propagated these charges by Novikova that Jews had charged the Russian famine, and in fact then Drumont goes on to further embellish this story, saying that Jews were also poisoning the grain that relief groups had collected to send to Russia. The final way of tracing this influence is by tracing texts and ideas. One central text that has been already mentioned numerous times in this conference, the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, is of course the most important and enduring text of modern anti-Semitism there is. It's first published in Russia in 1903. The Protocols owed a large debt to Brafman's conspiracy theories, but it creatively merged Brafman's tradition with other inspirations. So it's also plagiarizing a German anti-Semitic novel, Maurice Joly's parody of Napoleon III, and a deep awareness of political developments in Fin-de-Siècle Europe. Historians have long suspected that the Peripherie had something to do with the genesis of this document, although no one has ever found a smoking gun. But working on this close textual analysis of the protocols and reconstructing the networks that surrounded it, I've actually uncovered new evidence that appears to confirm that this text is indeed originated in this circle of Paris-based publicists. Indeed, some of the Achrana publications produced in the 1880s, which I showed in the previous slides, are early prototypes of the protocols and have full sections that ultimately end up in that document lifted in full. So if we acknowledge the protocols as the embodiment of this virulent new anti-Semitism that emerged at the Fin-de-Siècle, I think that this is the strongest evidence of all that Russian ideas played an important role in shaping this movement. I've argued in this paper that human mobility played an important role in shaping 19th century anti-Semitism. So I think it's not quite enough to write a transnational history of the circulation of texts. We actually need to think about transnational circulation itself as a factor that made the world imagined in these texts possible in the first place. Ironically then, anti-Semitism, which would tear the 20th century world apart, should be seen as a product of 19th century globalization, the growing convergence of different societies, people, and intellectual traditions. Thank you, and I'll stop there.
Thank you for this inspiring talk. I'm not sure whether you challenged some of our hypothesis formulated in the Corfu papers, but we will just discuss that later. We carry on, and in my opinion, we are coming home. We are coming to Central Europe. I want to introduce Áron Szele. He started his career as a historian in Bucharest and then changed to the Central University of Budapest, where he currently is writing on his PhD. And the title of his presentations is Paranoia, Pseudoscience, and the Fear of Decay, Antisemitism in the Ideology of Interwar Hungarian Fascism. You have the floor.
Thank you very much, Professor Rásky, and thank you for inviting me to this conference. It's a great honor and actually a privilege to participate in the discussion. And I'll try to contribute to it by actually making a few references. There are quite a bit of similarities between this previous talk that we just heard and my presentation concerning anti-Semitism in the political language of Hungarian fascism in the interwar period. So what I would like today to do is to make a very short and synthetic analysis of anti-Semitism within the ideology of Hungarian fascism, and I posit that it may be defined within the trilateral matrix of concepts. The first very important component is this late 19th century, early 20th century, turn of the century ideas of decay and modernity. The second is this idea of paranoia and systemic conspiracy theories. And the third is the legitimation of these two previous concepts through the utilization of pseudoscientific explanations. This decay and regeneration binomial it was a pervasive myth of the turn of the century, and it is present in many literary and scientific works of the period. I think the best way to explain it is if we make reference to this concept of liquid modernity, which was proposed by Zygmunt Bauman. And this entails that this perception as in intellectual but in other circles as well, that modernity itself had kind of run its course and had run awry, and it had consumed all the necessary meats of the community and had started to undermine the very foundations of identity itself. So instead of having a unified identity and a unified set of myths which held the community together, especially the national communities, there were multiple identities. And this, I think, created a sort of Fin-de-Siècle angst in a lot of circles. And the First World War really acted as a catalyst to generalize this type of perception and attitude. And nowhere is this more apparent than in Hungary, which had come out as a loser after the First World War, lost a significant amount of territory and of people. Here I make reference to this concept of liminoid existence, which was developed by British historian Roger Griffin when making reference to the apparition of the intellectual origins of fascist ideology in the interwar period. So this liminoid existence, which also was in place in Hungary, saw the order of things, the perception of normalcy completely changed, the order coming apart at the seams, and it felt that it was on a cusp of a great change. Whether this change be positive or negative was debatable. The answer to this sort of perception of decay and crisis, this sort of liminoid existence, this existence of living on the limits of modernity, the most coherent answer to this was the idea of regeneration, of revolutionary regeneration of the national community, of society, the state, and indeed of modern existence. And the best explanations for the decay and the best justifications for regeneration of state and society and of the nation itself, even spiritual revolution, were these ideas of conspiracy. We are dealing with, or they were rather dealing with, all sorts of events like the First World War, like the rise of mass society, the apparition of conflicts between social classes, as I said, the redefinition of national and self-identity on so many levels that this very complex set of phenomena that which birthed 20th century Europe into existence could not be really explained by a single explanation to the general, which the general public could utilize and which could be utilized for political mobilization. So it is my theory that the theories of conspiracy appeared to fill this niche and to fill this void. And as we've seen in the 19th century, or late 19th century and early 20th century, there was already a very big amount of promotion of the original systemic conspiracy theory, which was this theory of Jewish world conspiracy. So it came in very handy for these people to actually utilize, and the experience of the First World War and the failed democratic and communist regimes of 1918 and up to 1920 in Hungary seem to justify all of these things. And I will try to explain this the nature of conspiracy theories in general, and this is very much I think applicable to this idea of Jewish world conspiracy by making a reference to work of cultural studies of an American anthropologist and political scientist, Michael Barkan. He speaks a lot about contemporary conspiracy theories such as 9/11 conspiracy theories, these whole ideas of UFO conspiracy theories, but always these narratives have the same sort of characteristics. They produce something which he calls stigmatized knowledge, a type of knowledge that only a certain category of people know, and they provide very simple explanations to very complex phenomena, and they actually work through this principle of parsimony. So very simple explanation. The best explanation for something very complex and hard to understand is something simple. And the rules of systemic conspiracy theories, as Barkan says, is that the first is that nothing happens by accident. The second is that nothing is as it seems. And the third is that everything is connected. And he actually categorizes conspiracy theories on many levels, event conspiracies, systemic conspiracies, and so forth, but I will only speak of systemic conspiracies. So this fascist mythos and far-right mythos, because we can also apply to the far-right discourses in interwar Europe and in Hungary, of this Jewish world conspiracy can be defined within this systemic conspiracy. They have broad goals. They are usually conceived as securing control over a country or region or even in the entire world. And the goals are sweeping, but the conspiratorial machinery is generally simple. So the single evil organization which implements a plan to infiltrate and to subvert existing institutions. And the most utilized piece of literature in interwar Hungary is these protocols of the Elders of Zion, and others, smaller ones, which are coming from Germany as well. They are reproductions of these Russian texts that we just heard about. So as I've said, these conspiracy theories are a very good solution to liquid modernity or crisis because they provide very simple explanations. And my hypothesis is that conspiracy theories and ideologies which are based on them are a sort of byproduct of this certain type of late 19th and early 20th century modernity. It's a sort of exercise to endow meaning into historical processes. I will briefly speak about the concrete nature of these conspiracy theories in Hungary. And from my study of fascist and far-right texts in the interwar period, the characteristics which emerge of the Jews, of the Jewish stereotype, they are considered to be at the same time powerful and weak, at the same time animalistic and cunning, a-national and cosmopolitan, but at the same time these texts speak of Jews as possessing very strong, almost inborn and instinctual cultural traits, which they actively preserve to their obscurantist traditions and their religious practices. This Jewish world conspiracy and these anti-Semitic canards are really utilized by the Hungarian far right and especially of fascism throughout their existence, even in late 1940s, 1944, 1945. There are a number of examples. One is the book The Jewish Pursuit of World Domination by Vágó Pál, The Way of the Jews by a Hungarian fascist economist Mátyás Matolcsi. And there are these same types of trends and ideas that we can isolate them, that there is a century-old secret organization of Jews in action, and certain Jewish organizations like the Alliance Israélite Internationale, the B'nai Brit, they are all mentioned. And this organization is quintessentially filled with hatred towards Christians in general, and is bent on conquering nation states and the world from within. Their goal goal is to destroy the nation state in order to replace them with a weak international type of organization which would be under Jewish rules. And the methods which are used are always conspirative, and they are meant to degenerate and corrupt the body politic and the political regimes from within. Examples which are cited are the Jewish dominance in finance and politics, capitalism and liberalism, something which Hungarian fascists spoke very thoroughly against. This was one of the mainstay of their ideology, because Hungarian fascist ideology has a very leftist sort of tinge. It's very, very populist in tinge. It is identified with Jews. Bolshevism at the same time is also Jewish. They are spoken about all the time as being quote-unquote two sides of the same coin. They have the same ultimate goal to eliminate the nation and then take over the world. And we already heard yesterday about Jews being used as proxies and as symbols for all sorts of lines of argumentation. They are used for economic and social issues such as land reform in Hungary, the fair distribution of wealth and the redistribution of land, political issues such as the country which had a great majority of people who were politically disenfranchised. They are also blamed for political crises that had just occurred. The cleavage between elites and people are also attributed to Jews because of the infiltration of the elites by the Jews. What is a later development within the anti-Semitic discourses of Hungarian fascism and the far right, because one cannot really separate the two. They were people moving from one camp to another all the time and actually working to develop this discourse throughout the interwar period, is that the late development is the utilization of pseudoscience, I would call it, kind of scientific discourses appropriated for a political goal. And the definition of Jews moves away from this Jewish-Christian binomial which was dominant in interwar Hungary within the discourse of the regime and the opposition, and towards biological definitions. And I think that we can speak here about a transnational history, or at least a history of transfers, when concerning the development of this political discourse and language of anti-Semitism in Hungary, this biological discourse. So it was both created by a domestic tradition. The most important contributor to this was Mihály Lajos, who was a Hungarian zoologist and turned politician in the 1920s. And he was one of the most important Hungarian eugenicists of the 20th century. And he, from the outset, made this connection between Jews and the biological definition of the nation and the biological taxonomies of peoples, not as well as other types of biological species. He actually exported his knowledge of zoology into the human realm, and But also his disciples further developed, such as Mandi György and Bosnyák Zoltán, also developed this anthropological sort of pseudoscientific discourse further. But they also were working under the influence of foreign ideas of biological racism. So if we quote, they quote Werner Zombart, who is more or less influential, Hans Güntner, Walter Gross and others from Nazi Germany, but also people from the California eugenic group, such as Lothrop Stoddart, who was one of the most important influences in the development of Bosnyak's discourse, but also Popenow and others. The most amount of this material that I found is in the pages of a few publications. One was a journal called Új Európa, New Europe, which was a fledgling fascist scientific intellectual publication which started to appear in 1940 and dealt with all of the issues of these biological definition of nation, spatial definition of nation, and refining the nationalist, socialist, and fascist ideas of ideology within Hungary. And they concentrated, as I've said, from domestic tradition and from foreign imports through a racial definition of the Hungarian nation. And the conclusion was very shortly that Hungarians, of course, could not really claim racial superiority within this Nazi scheme of racial hierarchies. They were not, they could not relate to it positively. So they didn't subvert it, but they adopted it in a certain manner. They said that Hungarians, of course, are of a mixed racial heritage, but this racial heritage is mostly European and combines the best of European blood. So the Hungarian race is a quintessentially European race. And this was their discourse in order to frame themselves as one of the forerunners in the new order of Europe. Where hierarchy comes in is in the division between Hungarian race and the Jewish race. And there is a hierarchy here because Jews are described usually as a diseased and enclosed race, while possessing those characteristics that I've spoken about. Just a second. Okay. And also because of the fact that Hungarians, and this is a heritage of late 19th century Hungarian eugenic and racialist discourses, Hungarians are good because they have mixed blood, because they bring together all these good traits, while Jews are not, they are deficient from a biological perspective because of these self-imposed, enclosed nature of the race. At the same time, they have African traits because of their quote-unquote Negro blood. The Jews are defined as a quintessentially non-European foreign insert within the Hungarian body nation. But they also claim that because of this, Jewish blood is stronger than non-Jewish blood. So in the very isolated cases when mixes occur, then the very nature of Jewish blood is stronger and it corrupts the individual. So I will not speak about Bosniak too much because it's a, I think, a category within itself. So we can write a whole thesis, I think, on this circle. Another way in which new scientific so-called argumentation comes in to bolster the conspiracy theory is this relatively new and German science of geopolitics. These Hungarian writers, fascist authors writing in the Új Európa were very much influenced by Kellen, Haushofer, and others. And they claimed that the Hungarian nation was bonded biologically to the national space, an area which it was destined to dominate, and the anthropological type of the Hungarian was framed in such a way that he could dominate this sort of space. On the other hand, Jews were defined as a people which quintessentially possessed no link to any space, which made them at the same time inferior, but at the same time dangerous and superior. Matolcsy speaks about the transnational and spatial characteristics of Jews, and this is very much linked to this conspiracy theory about Jews, that they can move so easily through space, and in this way they can make transnational networks which can dominate nations and destroy them from within and from without. So the loyalty toward the Hungarian nation was biologically non-existent, as the Jews did not have an organic bond with the soil and with the space. And in certain texts, these concepts of deterritorialization and reterritorialization of Nazi theorist Walter Kristaller were used in order to justify the future displacement of peoples from territories, that the territory would be emptied of other peoples and of Jews, and then re-territorialized, filled with Hungarians instead. And this is the way in which they explained and tried to argue for spatial displacements and removal of peoples. And the third is, the last one, which I'll make reference to, is a narrative of history, which was an older discipline, an older scientific discipline in Europe and in Hungary. And they utilized historical evidence to bolster this conspiracy theory. They, especially when they made reference to European and Hungarian history from the late 17th onto the early 20th century, they described it in a teleological fashion in which there were two forces which were fighting one against the other, basically consisting of corrupt and infiltrated elites, aristocracy, which was infiltrated by Jewish agents, and the mass of the people, which could only secure agency through a strong authoritarian leadership. They claim that even modernity and the Enlightenment, the French Revolution, if it was not a Jewish creation, it was subverted by the Jews. So capitalism, materialism, and Bolshevism were all Jewish creations, which very interestingly were created in order to divert the positive outcome of progress. Because even in history, Hungarian fascist ideologies claim that they were progressive. And the term modern appears all the time. So it was a modernistic discourse to integrate within National Socialist and anti-Semitic, biological anti-Semitism of Nazi Europe. And this was the Hungarian version of this Dolchstoss myth, which was also utilized. So my final conclusion would be that this Hungarian fascist anti-Semitism as a product of political language can be defined by using this nexus of concepts, decay and rebirth, paranoia and systemic conspiracy, and the utilization of pseudoscience to bolster these arguments. Thank you very much.
Ja, ich glaube, da gibt es wieder viel zu fragen und zu diskutieren. We change language again. Wir ändern wieder die Sprache. Ich begrüße sehr herzlich Miloslav Szabó aus Bratislava von der Akademie der Wissenschaften. Ich auch hier wieder ganz kurz zum akademischen Lebenslauf, der mehr eine Tour durch Mitteleuropa ist: Prag, Berlin, Wien, Bratislava. Die wichtigste Station natürlich, dass er ein Jahr lang Research Fellow am Wiener Wiesenthal Institut war. Und der Titel seiner Präsentation lautet Zwischen Judapest und verjudetem Prag, Oberungarn bzw. die Slowakei als antisemitische Peripherie? Fragezeichen.
Thank you very much, Béla. My presentation is going to be in German, and I apologize to all who may not completely understand, but I hope the most of you will do. Also zwischen Judapest und verjudetem Prag, Oberungarn, Slowakei als antisemitische Peripherie. Ich bin froh, dass ich in vielen anknüpfen kann an meine Vorrede, die wesentliche Aspekte vielleicht ein bisschen tiefer beleuchtet haben. Ich kann mich auf das konzentrieren, was ich sagen möchte. Also in meinem Beitrag soll die eigentümliche Spannung zwischen den Kategorien Zentrum und Peripherie, die unlängst von der kulturwissenschaftlichen Forschung hervorgehoben wurde, für die Geschichte des Antisemitismus im ehemaligen Oberungarn bzw. in der Slowakei fruchtbar gemacht werden. In der Begrifflichkeit etwa der Weltsystemtheorie Immanuel Wallersteins stellte Oberungarn bzw. die Slowakei ein klares Beispiel für eine doppelte sozioökonomische Peripherie am Rand der zivilisierten Welt bzw. der Zentren der Habsburger Monarchie. Wollen wir jedoch den Ansatz auf ideologische Strömungen oder Semantiken wie der moderne Antisemitismus anwenden, müssen wir die Perspektive umdrehen. Ein monokausales Verhältnis der Abhängigkeit zwischen Zentrum und Peripherie in dem Sinne, dass das Zentrum aus der Peripherie lediglich Rohstoffe schöpfe, um sie dann mit Fertigprodukten zu beliefern, wäre irreführend. Im Zentrum des Forschungsinteresses muss vielmehr die Dynamik des mehrschichtigen Wissens- und Machttransfers zwischen antisemitischen Zentren und Peripherien stehen. Der Antisemitismus des 19. und frühen 20. Jahrhunderts war selbst eine Art Peripherie, was seine diskursive Stärke und mehr noch sein politisches Gewicht angeht. Deswegen positionierten seine Wegbereiter und Verfechter sich gegen die Zentren der damaligen Welt, wovon nicht zuletzt antisemitische Verschwörungsphantasmen wie die schon erwähnten Protokolle der Weisen von Zion Zeugnis ablegen. In meinem Beitrag soll diese Perspektive um die Einbeziehung der antisemitischen Autostereotype erweitert werden, die ebenfalls mit Begriffen wie Zentrum und Peripherie erläutert werden. Dies wird auf 4 Ebenen stattfinden. Geht das? Ah, okay. Ja, ich bin schon zu weit. Okay. Also nochmal. Nein, jetzt ist es wieder zu weit. Zweite. Jetzt, ja genau. Nee, die genau, ja, okay. Also die Gliederung, die 4 Ebenen. Budapest, ich werde über Budapest als Peripherie des antisemitischen Universums reden, dann über Oberungarn als Peripherie des ungarischen Antisemitismus, Oberungarn als Peripherie des europäischen Antisemitismus und dann schließlich Slowakei der Zwischenkriegszeit über alte Peripherie und neue Zentren. Also zur ersten Ebene, der ungarische politische Antisemitismus entfaltete sich in den 1880er Jahren im Umfeld der Ritualmordbeschuldigung von Tisza-Esla, die 2 große Wellen der antijüdischen Gewalt nach sich zog. In dieser Atmosphäre, die infolge der Freisprechung der beschuldigten Juden noch zusätzlich aufgeheizt wurde, konstituierte sich die Antisemitenpartei, die jedoch bei den Landtagwahlen von 1884 bzw. 87 nur wenige Parlamentssitze erringen konnte und allmählich von der politischen Bühne verschwand. In den 1890er Jahren wurde die antisemitische Propaganda zur Domäne der katholischen Volkspartei, die sich von den Parlamentswahlen von 1896 einen ähnlichen Durchbruch wie einst die Antisemiten erhoffte. Anders als diese in den 1880er Jahren konnten die Propagandisten der Volkspartei auf spektakuläre Erfolge der Antisemiten in West- und Zentraleuropa hinweisen. Gerade in diesem Kontext griffen sie die Semantik von Zentrum und Peripherie auf, was ich am Beispiel von 2 Karikaturen aus der humoristischen Zeitschrift Herr Kopater darstellen möchte. Ich hoffe, jetzt klappt das. Nee. Ah, doch. Das dauert eine Weile. Ja, das ist es. Gut, jetzt habe ich das. Die Karikaturen, die im Wahljahr 1896 außer in ungarische auch in deutsche und slowakische Sprache verlegt wurde. Die ungarischen Antisemiten übernahmen von ihrem Wiener Gesinnungsgenossen, dem Führer der christlich-sozialen Partei Karl Lueger, das berüchtigte Schimpfwort Judapest, um sich von ihrem eigenen Zentrum der angeblich verjudeten, das heißt unter zersetzendem Einfluss der jüdischen Finanzleute und Journalisten stehenden ungarischen Hauptstadt zu distanzieren. Angesichts dieser vermeintlich umfassenden Verjudung, in Wirklichkeit aufgrund ihrer Schwäche, porträtierten sie sich als Peripherie der antisemitischen Zentren des damaligen Europa. Jetzt das erste Beispiel, man sieht zwei Gestalten, die sich ein Straßenbild von Budapest anschauen. Ein französischer Gast in der Uniform ist ein Zeichen, denke ich, klares Zeichen, dass es sich um ein Anti-Dreyfusar handelt, und der Ungar, der das nicht sieht, dass es sich nicht um Magyaren handelt, wird dann aufgeklärt, dass es doch in Frankreich dreckige Juden sind, und so wird das Zentrum Produzent des antisemitischen Wissens. Das zweite Beispiel wird dasselbe in einem anderen Kontext sagen, und zwar in Wien. Da ist eine Bestie, eine jüdische Bestie, alias Israelit, dargestellt, das als Hund heult, weil ihm eben Karl Lueger auf den Schwanz tritt, und Budapest durch die Synagoge im Hintergrund wieder als Judapest verzerrt, wird wieder als nicht genug antisemitisch dargestellt. Nicht weniger als die ungarischen Antisemiten stimmten die slowakischen Nationalisten mit Lueger überein, die Juden in erster Linie als Verkörperung der Magyarisierungspolitik verunglimpften. Im Verhältnis zu ungarischen Antisemiten im Umfeld der katholischen Volkspartei stellten die slowakischen Nationalisten bzw. das von ihnen angepriesene slowakische Volk eine antisemitische Peripherie dar. Hier sieht man die ethnografische Karte. Im Norden lebten die Slowaken, die Grünen. Man sieht Budapest im Zentrum, die nördliche Peripherie, Oberungarn. Der politische Antisemitismus der 1880er Jahre fand nicht zuletzt bei der slowakischsprachigen Bevölkerung im Norden des Landes Unterstützung. Während die Repräsentanten der slowakischen Nationalbewegung dem politischen Antisemitismus der 1880er Jahre gegenüber in einer Art wohlwollender Distanz verharrt waren, schlossen sie mit der katholischen Volkspartei im Vorfeld der Parlamentswahlen von 1896 ein regelrechtes Bündnis. Wie die Volkspartei verbreiten damals auch die Presseorgane der slowakischen Nationalisten eine antisemitische Propaganda, die das liberale Establishment als Helfershelfer bei der jüdischen Zersetzung verzerrte, zu welchem Zweck sie, wie übrigens auch die ungarischen Antisemiten und die Wiener Christlich-Sozialen, die 1896 aus dem Anlass der vermeintlichen Ankunft der alten Magyaren in Europa zelebrierte Millenniumsfeier aufs Korn nahmen. Jetzt ein Beispiel, das ist eine berüchtigte, bekannte Karikatur, wo die Juden bei der neuen Landnahme die alten Magyaren verzerrt werden, und das Establishment, der Premierminister, der Erzbischof, heißen sie willkommen. Ja, das wird immer wieder auch abgebildet bis heute. Aber es erschien eben auch auf Deutsch und auf Slowakisch. Man sieht, dass die Volkspartei wirklich dabei war, einen Durchbruch zu erzielen, was nicht gelang schließlich. Jetzt selbes Sujet im slowakischen Milieu, und dann der Wiener Kikeriki hat auch sehr viel mit diesem Thema gearbeitet, wo der heilige Stephan meint, dass er dachte, er hätte die Ungarn zum Christentum bekehrt. So, die Komplementarität des antisemitischen Narrativs vom Zentrum und Peripherie werde ich im Folgenden am Beispiel eines Ritualmordgerüchts veranschaulichen, das sich 1900 in Reaktion auf die berüchtigte Affäre im böhmischen Polna von oberungarischen Námesto, slowakischen Námesto aus verbreitete. Ich zeige noch, kann ich noch zurück, oder zu der Karte. Genau, das ist der nördlichste Zipfel, der grüne, also an der galizischen Grenze liegt Námesto, also der äußerste Rand, Peripherie. Genau. Ja, genau. Das ist die Synagoge Námesto. Nachdem die Juden hier beschuldigt wurden, einen tot aufgefundenen Jungen rituell geschlachtet zu haben, nahmen sich sowohl die katholische Hauptstadtpresse als auch slowakische Publizisten der Affäre an, um daraus gemeinsam oder zumindest parallel einen Gegensatz zwischen dem loyalen, armen slowakischen Volk und den jüdischen Ausbeutern an der ungarischen Peripherie zu konstruieren. Indem sie die produktive Spannung zwischen Zentrum und Peripherie auf die lokale Ebene verlegten, nahmen sie selber die Rolle des antisemitischen Zentrums ein. Eine Schlüsselposition fiel dabei dem Parlamentsabgeordneten Zoltán Meškal, der die Volkspartei im Wahlbezirk zu dem Námesto gehörte, während 2 Wahlperioden im ungarischen Landtag vertrat. Nachdem der Justizminister den zuständigen mit der Volkspartei sympathisierenden Untersuchungsrichter abberufen hatte, um eine neue Tisza-Esla-Affäre zu verhindern, interpellierte Meškal ihn und bat um Aufklärung. Dabei knüpfte er an das in ganz Zentraleuropa verbreitete Narrativ an, das sich vom Radikalantisemitismus distanzierte und das Judentum lediglich indirekt angriff, weil dieses angeblich manche mit Menschenopfern assoziierte jüdische Sekten dulde. Hier zeichnet sich die dritte diskursive Ebene an, für die der Transfer des antisemitischen Wissens zwischen Zentrum und Peripherie bezeichnend war. Die Ritualmordbeschuldigung um 1900 erfuhr wesentliche diskursive Transformation, die der Historiker Hillis als Modernisierung des frühneuzeitlichen Ritualmordnarrativs beschreibt, in dem religiöse und magische Elemente wie Wiederholung des Gottesmordes oder Konsumation des Opferblutes vorherrschten. Dieser semantische Rahmen wurde um 1900 säkularisiert, sodass die Juden zunehmend als brutale Mörder ethnisiert und kriminalisiert wurden. Kiel zufolge waren für diese Transformation insbesondere 3 narrative Elemente prägend. Auffinden eines entbluteten Leichnams, eine überproportionale Wunde am Hals des Opfers und aktive Beteiligung von mehreren Tätern. Diese Zusammenhänge fanden ihren Ausdruck in einer besonderen Ikonografie, die durch folgende Abbildungen belegt werden kann. Man sieht, also religiöse Bezüge sind schon ganz im Hintergrund, obwohl da ein betender Jude auftritt, aber es geht wirklich um diese Brutalität vor allem. Wie stark solche Darstellungen des Ritualmordwissens von Experten sowohl in Zentren wie an der Peripherie prägten, belegt folgendes Zitat aus einem Leserbrief, dessen Autor in Wirklichkeit ein Seelsorger aus der Region um Námesto war und der in der Budapester Tageszeitung der Volkspartei abgedruckt wurde. Ich werde es nicht ganz vorlesen, aber wenn man sich die Bilder vor Augen hält, das ist wirklich ein Kommentar dazu, was wir gesehen haben. Und das erschien in der Tageszeitung der katholischen Volkspartei von einem katholischen Seelsorger geschrieben. Das ist wirklich ein Indiz dafür, dass die Säkularisierung weit fortgeschritten war. Wie diese Überschneidungen und Transfers zwischen antisemitischen Zentren und Peripherien sich reproduzieren konnten, will ich schließlich an der Situation nach dem Ersten Weltkrieg darlegen, als Oberungarn Teil der neuen tschechoslowakischen Republik wurde. Zwar versuchten auch die neuen Machthaber in ihrer Propaganda die alten Stereotype von Judapest aufrechtzuerhalten, so im Kontext des Krieges gegen die ungarische Räterepublik von 1919. Da ist wieder von Judapest die Rede und werden die Kommissare mit ihren jüdischen Namen kenntlich gemacht. Also wenn nicht die visuelle Darstellung schon daran erinnert. Aber die antisemitische Spannung zwischen Zentrum und Peripherie verlagerte sich allmählich. Insbesondere Vertreter und Anhänger der Opposition katholischen Slowakischen Volkspartei, die knüpfte wiederum an die Tradition der Ungarischen Volkspartei, also die Anhänger der Opposition Slowakischen Volkspartei griffen als Inbegriff der Verjudung anstelle von Judapest zunehmend das neue Zentrum Prag an, also Hauptstadt der Tschechoslowakei. Diese Tendenz, also hier habe ich noch ein Zitat eigentlich, genau, also der Sekretär der Slowakischen Volkspartei Josef Hamaj 1920 geschrieben, die Tschechoslowakische Republik sei zum Melku jüdischer Wucherer und Geschäftemacher geworden. Prag und Brühl hätten einen durch und durch Judapester Anstrich, der nicht bloß Magyarisierung von Prag aus, schwer vorstellbar, aber nicht bloß Magyarisierung, sondern ebenfalls roten jüdischen Sozialismus begünstigte. Diese Tendenz nahm in den 1930er Jahren schlagartig zu, als Radikale im Umfeld der Slowakischen Volkspartei die Propaganda gegen den Judeobolschewismus wiederaufnahmen, wobei manche von ihnen aus ihren Sympathien mit NS-Deutschland kein Hehl machten. In diesem Kontext kam es zu einer letzten Umkodierung des Begriffspaars Zentrum und Peripherie. Als Beispiel sollen hier abschließend die Radiosendungen von Ludowit Mutnianski angeführt werden, die vom Reichssender Wien, also von hier, im Herbst 1938 ausgestrahlt wurden. Dies geschah auf dem Höhepunkt der außenpolitischen Krise, die durch sogenanntes Münchner Abkommen gelöst werden sollte, das große Teile des tschechoslowakischen Gebiets NS-Deutschland zusprach und zugleich die Föderalisierung der Tschechoslowakei zur Folge hatte. Als kurz davor die tschechoslowakische Regierung Mobilisierung angeordnet hatte, hetzte Mutnianski in einer seiner Sendungen gegen das tschechoslowakische Establishment mit folgenden Worten: Wir erheben Protest dagegen, dass unsere geliebte slowakische Jugend für die jüdisch-bolschewistischen Interessen des Moskau-Agenten Eduard Beneš ihr Blut vergieße. Dadurch bewies er abermals die Komplementarität des Begriffspaars Zentrum und Peripherie. Die Slowakei blieb eine antisemitische Peripherie, die den Kampf des Zentrums bekräftigen sollte. Die Machtposition des neuen antisemitischen Zentrums, NS-Deutschland, brachte es jedoch mit sich, dass auch die Peripherie sich einem gleichsam planetarischen Ringen gegen das jüdische Zentrum Moskau und dessen Peripherie Prag wähnen durfte. Eine Antwort auf die Frage, inwiefern solche Propaganda die Bevölkerung für das neue Regime des slowakischen Verbündeten NS-Deutschlands zu gewinnen vermochte, wird allerdings erst die künftige Forschung geben können. Vielen Dank für die Aufmerksamkeit.
Auch ich danke. I think we have another 25 minutes to discuss the common idea, I would say cautiously, of the papers now was a kind of the aspect of modernization of traditional anti-Semitic ideas in certain frameworks, so shifting towards new, maybe more modern frameworks. I would kind of put it this way, but I pass on the floor to you for questions. Roman.
Thank you. Thank you very much for all the three illuminating papers. And my question is to Dr. Szele. Your terminology about pseudoscience, that's quite interesting. We are very easy in speaking about pseudoscience, but many of the people you named were university professors and seen in their times not as pseudoscientists but as science. And it's sometimes a little bit problematic to use pseudoscience because they are established scholars in their times, and it may be quite a little bit more helpful to say that there's something wrong in their science, in the way they did science, and tend to have this label pseudoscience. And we have this book from Dirk Rupno about pseudowissenschaft, pseudoscience, and his argument is quite strange. I would oppose it, but there is no possibility to have this distinction if you have these university professors who promote anti-Semitic and so on. And also a question to Professor Hillis, to what degree the official Tsarist empire promoted this anti-Semitic, what is the evidence in the archives about the official policy of the Tsarist empire in the context of your paper? Thank you.
I can begin while maybe he's formulating his thoughts. Speaking of policy is somewhat difficult in that from the archival sources I've seen, it seems to me that the Ochrana is really leading this, and St. Petersburg is actually to a large extent not quite aware of what's going on, and in fact Rachkovsky, the head of the Ochrana whom I was talking about, eventually gets fired in 1902 because he's done all this stuff that without the permission of St. Petersburg, he's acting sort of around the autocracy, and that doesn't make the Tsar very happy. That said, as far as the Ochrana goes, initially because the regime is so afraid of the revolutionaries, they are given more or less free rein. And so I've worked extensively in the Ochrana archive, which shows, and this is how I've traced that they were in fact the folks who authored these pieces, and it's their anxieties about Jews are evident in that archive, but so are the efforts to respond to this perceived threat through the press, through Agent Provocateur, and through everything else I've talked about. So it's a very concerted policy on Rachkovsky's part.
This term of pseudoscience is very hindsighted. It's driven by our current knowledge about what exactly science was and what it isn't. And I agree with you completely that in this sense, we're talking about a certain paradigm of science which was in place in the early 20th century up to 1945, and this whole discussion about physical anthropology, morphology, serology, all of these questions are a piece of science history, and I think that if we make reference to this paradigm of Thomas Kuhn, this was the normal science of the time. They weren't yet arrived at the paradigm shift, which would come later, and the evidence supporting this is quite great, because I mentioned Mihály Lajos, this zoologist. He was one of the most respected scientific minds of Hungary at the time, and his disciple Bosnyák Zoltán, who utilized this scientific discourse and bound it together with politics even more than his teacher Mihály, was in 1941 they made it possible for him to create an institute to study the Jewish question. This was this biopolitical and Jewish question institute in Hungary. So it was very much considered to be scientific and generally accepted. And I think this was one of the dangers at that time, this was why it was so easy for scientists to utilize their demarches for political ends.
Okay, Dimitrios, just asking to be very short because we have lots of questions.
Of I'd like to thank all three speakers for their papers. If I may, two questions to Professor Hillis about, if I understood your paper correctly, you spoke about a distinctive character in Russian anti-Semitism. Could I ask you to elaborate a little bit about what made it distinctive in contrast to the anti-Semitism of Western Europe? And I'm interested in texts and anti-Semitic texts. You spoke a lot about the Bronfan, if I could say it correctly, tradition. Did you find any connections to other Russian texts, such as the one by Vladimir Dal, and also the ones published by Pranaitis and Hippolyte Lutostansky? That's my second question. Thanks.
Okay.
Maybe we collect them, then we have better time control. Daniel?
Quick question for Faith. I may have missed it because I missed the first few minutes of your. I may have missed it because I missed the first few minutes of your talk. But how does this kind of toolbox that the Ochrana is using against the Jews, how does this compare to, say, the treatment of Polish emigre communities, Russian Poles in Paris, in London and things like this, and Okhrana surveillance of those nationalist groups? Are they treating them the same? Are they doing different things? Is it part of a wider destabilization of groups, or is it specifically aimed at Jewish groups or left groups and things like that?
Ich habe eine Frage jetzt für Miloslav Szabó. Diese Selbstpositionierung der Antisemiten gegen ein angebliches jüdisches Zentrum, was ja in gewisser Weise eine Selbstperipherisierung sozusagen ist, darin taucht sozusagen das Motiv, das wir am ersten Tag diskutiert haben, des angeblichen antisemitischen Antikolonialismus ein Stück weit wieder auf. Und mich würde einfach interessieren, ob in diesen Diskursen eben auch Motive des Kolonialismus, der angeblichen Kolonisierung der Peripherie durch das Zentrum, jüdische Zentrum, angeblich jüdische Zentrum Budapest, Prag und so weiter auftaucht.
Okay, let's answer this round.
Ja, so explizit nicht. So, ich denke, dass das für Ungarn war die Semantik des Kolonialismus einfach nicht vorhanden. Also das war nicht so der Diskurs damals. Aber so, wie Sie es beschrieben haben, so übertragen kann man das aus heutiger Sicht vielleicht interpretieren. Aber worum es ging, wie auch die Karikaturen gezeigt haben, hoffe ich, es war also sehr viel nationale Semantik im Spiel. Und dieses, also so Bedrohung für das Nationale. Also die Juden waren haben die nationale Hauptstadt, das Zentrum des nationalen Lebens usurpiert, und man fühlte sich als peripher gegenüber Fortgeschrittenen in Wien, die schon erkannt haben, die Gefahr, und kämpfen dagegen. Das war gerade die Zeit, als Lüger um die Macht gekämpft hat. Das war eigentlich hat schon gewonnen, nur der Kaiser wollte das noch nicht wahrhaben. Das war gerade die Zeit, und das war in Budapest oder auch in der Slowakei stark rezipiert worden.
All right, thank you for the question about what is distinctive. I, in the interest of time, cut out the last paragraph of my talk where I tried to clarify that. But the argument is less that it's distinctive and more that it's a forerunner, so that these kinds of ideas that become very prevalent in the European setting by the 1880s and 1890s are already beginning to coalesce in Russia in the 60s and 70s. So the notion that the periphery is actually at the forefront. So the elements of this are the sort of racialization, the notion of conspiracy. I do think there's something about the autocratic mode of governance that sort of lends itself to conspiracy theories. And then finally, the connection of this Jewish question to a sort of the emblematic feature of a full-fledged anti-liberal politics. And that's what anti-liberals in Europe by the late 19th century are looking to Russia and saying, hey, we like this, liberalism isn't working, let's go with them. So it's a forerunner rather than completely distinctive. On the question about nationality policy, yes, these immigrant colonies are extremely cosmopolitan places, and it seems that actually there are very few great Russians there, besides Jews, many Poles, many Ukrainians, many Caucasian, Armenians, and Georgians. And so the Okhrana does indeed play with these ideas, saying that these people are not real Russians, we represent real Russia, although it's complicated because Rachkovsky, that chief himself, is from Ukraine and is of mixed Polish-Ukrainian heritage and actually is Catholic, which is interesting. But that said, the Jewish issue really becomes, again, a sort of a cultural code. Other people have invoked this idea, in part because this longstanding notion of the conspiracy theory, but in part because I think the men who are interested in undermining this asylum policy realize that this is salient in the European setting as well. So, Europeans are much less concerned about what Ukrainians, Poles, and Georgians are doing than what Jews are doing in this age of incipient anti-Semitism. So it's all these groups are together, but I think Jews are particularly, the Jewish question is very, very evident in this policy.
Brendan.
Thanks for the papers. Faith, I had a couple of quick questions for you. Absolutely loved your presentation. And the first thing I wanted to ask was about the title of your presentation, which is A Model on the Margins, Russian Judophobia and European Antisemitism. Judophobia, obviously you're invoking John Clear, I think, here, with this distinction between Judophobia and anti-Semitism. But the empirical material in your paper seems to argue against that distinction.
Yeah.
So I just wondered what your position on that was. And the second question was about the mobilization of people and migration. You very convincingly showed that this is key to anti-Semitism in the late 19th century. What about after the Russian Revolution? What about the migration of the white emigre communities into the West after 1917? What role do you think this has for interwar anti-Semitism and ultimately during the war as well?
I also have a question for Faith Hillis. So how do you account for the fact that it's occurring earlier in Russia than in Western Europe?
Sorry,
so you argued that in Russia this appears earlier than in Western Europe. How did you account for that in any way? Do you have an explanation as to why this appears around the 1860s in Russia? How do you explain this?
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Richard.
Thank you. Also for Faith, my earlier comment was going to be about the post-war white emigration, because that is the story does continue on, for example, to the United States with Boris Brazil, for example, who brings the protocols there. So it's definitely something that keeps going. I was curious about, you're talking about Switzerland and France and Britain to a degree. I was curious if you would come across anything regarding connections to Germany. I know there's the book by Kellogg, I think, who talks about the influence on the Nazis, and that's, I think, really overstated, but this possibly, obviously, brings the story earlier. If there was anything that you found there, or was it just on the margin on the other side of Germany, in a sense?
Do you need a little bit of time?
No, I can go. Brendan, first of all, on the title, you're right, actually. I think it was sort of an afterthought when I changed it, but I'm actually arguing against the sort of Judeophobia notion that this is a sort of modern anti-Semitism coalescing. So point well taken there. To both on the white immigrant communities, this is incredibly important in thinking about continuities. And my story, it's really interesting. The leftist radicals leave after 1917 and go back to Russia, and then the new wave comes in and in many cases moves into the same neighborhoods where the old immigrants had been living. That said, I haven't done that later part of research yet, so I can't speak to that yet, other than saying that there's been these bits of pieces of work, some cited, that have been done that are excellent and that I hope to build on. I think the question about Germany and also the question why earlier I can take as a single question. So there are lots of Russian immigrants in Germany, mostly a student population, also some in Austria, some in the Balkans. And the Ochrana is present there too, surveilling the communities, trying to sow discord in them. But what I haven't found there is efforts to promote anti-Semitism in those settings. Perhaps we might argue because Germany is self-producing, these radical anti-Semitic critiques from the beginning, but I think it also has to do, and this goes to Raul's question of the fact that Russia doesn't have a liberal state and doesn't have a Jewish emancipation. I think this is a crucial key. And so, Germany has Jewish emancipation, has a liberal state, but it's not the same in that Russians from the beginning are expelled. They are not offered asylum in Germany, so it's not the same kind of safe haven that you have in the West. And so I think that this issue of combating liberalism via anti-Semitism is actually a key to this story. So that's why I focused on the Western setting where these anti-Semitic campaigns are more active. And I think that's why we began to see this critique of the liberal order earlier in Russia.
Eva and Thomas.
Faith, thank you for your presentation. It was really interesting. I just want to ask you that, don't you find that Raczkowski was not a simple anti-Semite? Anyway, as we know, or as we may know, Raczkowski was the cleverest Ochrana officer to realize very soon that the real danger for the Tsarist regime is represented not by the SR terrorists, but by the awakening socialist working movement. And he promoted a clandestine measure very soon, at the very beginning of the 20th century, to protect the Tsarist regime from the socialist workings movement. And so he was a clever guy anyway. So do you really think that Raczkowski, by fighting the revolution, and in his fight against revolution, he used, of course, the anti-Semitic language and all kinds of subcultural signs. Did he really believe in Jewish word conspiracy?
Did you understand?
It's difficult for me to hear, I'm sorry.
So did Raczkowski really believe in
Did he really believe this? Okay, thank you.
Aber ich möchte etwas von Miloslav fragen. Geht das zusammen?
Ja.
Okay. Zwei sehr kurze Fragen möchte ich hier formulieren. Du hast deklariert, dass Kolonialismus als interpretativer Kontext in Ungarn nicht nutzbar ist. Ich würde gerne fragen, wie du zwei sehr wichtige Sachen dann erklären könntest. Trianon, also 1920, von der Perspektive der ungarischen Nationalisten. Und eine ganz andere Sache, die sogenannten Zigeunerrepräsentation im 19. und 20. Jahrhundert in der ungarischen Kulturgeschichte. Danke.
Then I have a question to Áron. It wasn't quite clear to me what is understood under Hungarian fascism, because in Austria we have the problem that we learned always at the university, competitive fascisms, the Austro-fascism and the Nazis. And there seems to be a similar possibility in Hungary. There are the more conservatives, fascists, and the modernists, which are kind of bringing in modern aspects. And I thought all this, what you brought up, is kind of this modern faction, which is revolutionizing in a way anti-Semitism. And the question is whether what happens on the, let's say, more conservative right wing. I wouldn't even say, oh, am I wrong in this kind of looking at the problem that what you are talking about is they're a very modernizing the whole aspect. No, it's you. Okay.
Okay. Does Raczkowski, and actually do all of these people, all of my activists believe, is a very difficult question that I've really struggled with. A lot of my figures have, they began as social democrats. There's also a lot of apostates in my story, so they begin as Jews and then renounce this and go on to be anti-Semites. And it's just very difficult for me to say what they think that they're doing and what they believe. Raczkowski himself, part of what gets him fired in 1902, as I mentioned, he's off doing all these things without authorization. But one of the things is he opens a joint stock company in Belgium, and he's using this to get extra money for his publication. So, this man who's writing all of this, about capitalist conspiracies is himself involved in a capitalist conspiracy, as it were. So it raises eyebrows. And I do think that, what I'm certain these people believe in is they believe in their own power. And so they're also using this rhetoric as a way of gaining influence, gaining power, gaining prestige. And beyond that, it's really difficult, unfortunately, for me to say.
Danke, Eva, das ist natürlich, oder sind zwei ziemlich schwierige Fragen. Vielleicht habe ich mich nicht ganz genau ausgedrückt. Ich meinte, Kolonialismusdiskurs wäre nicht vorhanden. Ich meinte damit, dass vielleicht nicht dieser imperiale Diskurs vorhanden war, also wie in Westeuropa. Und natürlich wusste man in Ungarn, in welchem Teil der Welt man sich befindet und dass Europa eine Kolonialmacht ist und so weiter. Aber ich denke, das ist trotzdem ein Unterschied. Also die Wahrnehmung des Raums in Ungarn und, sagen wir, in Frankreich oder auch in Deutschland. Und nur das meinte ich damit, dass dieser Diskurs nicht vorhanden war, dass man das Imperiale anders gedacht hat. Also das war immer ein Königreich Ungarn und das war jetzt keine expandierende Macht irgendwo in der Übersee. Und vielleicht habe ich das zu eng gefasst, aber das habe ich gemeint. Und mit Trianon, da bist du, denke ich, ein bisschen kompetenter als ich. Ich würde vielleicht noch ganz kurz zum Antiziganismus sagen. Das ist wirklich die Stelle, wo sich das ein bisschen überschneidet, wo man denkt, dass man eine andere zivilisatorische Stufe ist und dass man und wo sich auch, also sagen wir mal, ein Verbindungsglied, weil von anderen Nationalitäten dachte man eigentlich nicht anders oft. Also wenn man sich Diskurse über die Slowaken, Rumänen anschaut, das ist alles paternalistisch, das ist alles von oben herab als Vertreter der Zivilisation. Und der ungarische Diskurs funktioniert da wirklich in dem Sinn kolonial, dass man so eine zivilisatorische Mission zu erfüllen hat, dass man integrieren soll, also dass man wirklich ein Imperium aufbauen soll. Also insofern kann ich nur zustimmen.
Áron? You again. Áron.
Yes, well, I think that part of my answer would be that these conservative far-right and ultimately fascist political movements and ideologies and discourses, they do not exist in a clear separation between themselves. At least in Hungary, in the interwar period, Hungarian fascism developed from this hotbed of right-wing conservatism and its opposition, which was also had a number of common elements within the discourse, only if we refer to anti-Semitism. And there is a certain amount of exchange, and there are very tributary to some of the ideas, and indeed some of their ideas about biological anti-Semitism are developed without the fascist movement itself, and then it is adopted because they did not possess the level of intellectuals within the party to actually develop, and then they just reprinted some of the arguments and utilized them for their own purposes. What is different, I think, between conservative right-wing and far-right and fascist discourses in Hungary are the solutions to this perceived crisis, this paranoia of Jewish world conspiracy and of biological differences between Hungarian races and race and the Jewish minority. These solutions of deterritorialization, Szalos's pretty famous concept of asemitism, which is very often translated as that he wasn't an anti-Semitic, but in fact he was asemitism meant a life free of Jews. So a very how do you say this, honest and clear declaration from the outset that he wanted to propose a really radical solution to the so-called Jewish question. The whole idea of revolutionizing society in a radical way, which included anti-Semitism and asemitism, is solely a fascist product. Right-wing circles, their best expression before the apparition of fascism was numerus clausus, so they wanted to exclude and to isolate the Jews in the early 1920s. But fascists actually started to propose more and more vehemently and clearly as the 1930s and 1940s went on, this total separation, deterritorialization of the Jewish element, the revolutionizing of society, which would actually get rid of elites completely because they framed them as a Jewish creation, as a Jewish elites which were corrupted by Jews. And then this whole idea of cleansing and regeneration and rebirth was and the radical solution to the Jewish question, I think, is something that we find more or less only in fascist texts.
I guess you partly answered my question, because my question, I guess, does this work?
Yep.
I guess you partly answered my question, because my question had to do with, I mean, you account for the anti-Semitism in the ideology of interwar Hungarian fascism by referring to decay, paranoia, and pseudoscience. But these were factors that contribute everywhere, not everywhere, but almost in all cases that had fascist movements or far-right movements in interwar Europe. You have these elements impacting their ideology. Now, what I was curious is what is specific to Hungary, and how do the elements that are specific to Hungary interlock with these ideas of decay, paranoia, pseudoscience, which are valid across borders in more than one setting?
Yeah, so basically I would just continue what I started at the previous answer. It's the solutions that they propose. And as I've said, one cannot really isolate really specific traits of even the Jewish stereotype, and the utilization of science or pseudoscience, whatever we might want to call it, is not a fascist trait. And there are a number of people, fellow travelers is the best categorization of them, that they travel to fascist movements, join them, then go back to far-right movements, and there is a certain amount of competition between the regime and the fascist movements itself, which kind of was the main reason for the Holocaust in Hungary and for the anti-Semitic laws that were passed in the late 30s and the early 40s. So we cannot disentangle, I think, the fascism from the discussion on anti-Semitism in Hungary, but at the same time, it is a key factor, I think, that drove this whole mechanism forward.
Okay, thank you. I see there are no more questions, even though for me they were opened up more questions were opened up now in the discussions than answered, but I have to close the panel. We have a half an hour coffee break now, and we'll see you for the last panel at 11:15, same place, same station. Okay, thank you very much.